Okay, now we're going to learn a new factoring technique, and what we have talked about so far is always factor out the GCF every time. You have to look and see if there is one. Then we look to see how many terms we have. So if we had 4 terms, we factored using the grouping method. Now what if we have 3 terms? If we have 3 terms, which is what we see here, anything in the form of x squared plus something x plus some number, then we're going to use what we call the trial and error method. Now before we get into that, I want us to do multiplication and kind of think about how we could get back to the factorization. So let's look at this first binomial multiplication. In order to do that, we would have to distribute. So let's see, x times x would give us x squared, and x times 4 would be a plus 4x. And now we're done distributing the x. So distributing the 5, we'd have 5 times x is plus 5x, and 5 times 4 would be plus 20. And then, of course, we would collect our like terms to get x squared plus 9x plus 20. All right, let's look at the next one, because this is identical except the signs are negative instead of positive. So here again, we would distribute to get x squared, and then minus 4x, now distributing our negative 5 to get minus 5x, and then a positive 20. When we combine our like terms, we get x squared minus 9x plus 20. Now I want to pause for just a second, and I want us to look at both of these answers. These answers are almost identical, aren't they? In fact, the x squared part is identical, and the positive 20 part is identical. The only difference is in the signs of our middle term. Well, think about how our original problem started out different. This was plus and plus. This one was minus and minus. Notice how the middle term here turned out to be positive if both of the terms were positive, and the middle term turned out to be negative if both of the signs were negative. That's very interesting, isn't it? Now let's look at the last term. The last term, this 20, is the exact same thing in both of these problems. Well, you think about where the 20 came from. The 20 came from multiplying the 5 times the 4. And here again, this 20 came from multiplying the 5 times the 4. So it really didn't matter what those signs were. Because they were the same sign, our last answer is always positive. That's very important to understand. Let's look at one more here, another variation of it. We have x minus 5 times x plus 4. So here again, we're going to do our distribution. So we'll have x squared and then plus 4x. Now distributing our negative 5 to get minus 5x and minus 20. Now collect your like terms to get x squared minus x minus 20. Okay, oh, that's not very pretty. There we go. Now do you notice that the last term is very similar, but this time it's a negative? That's because when we multiplied opposite signs, our answer was negative. This last term in the expansion, which is what we call it, in the multiplication, always comes from multiplying the last items in the binomial. This first term always comes from multiplying the first terms in the binomials. This is extremely important. Now, do you notice that the middle term here always came from combining what happens when we multiply their inner and our outer terms together? That will always be the case. This middle term came from combining those two. This middle term came from combining those two. When we look at exactly what happens when we multiply them, it's going to make it much better when we go backwards.